This is the Comics Alternative Webcomics, reviews of The Abominable Charles Christopher, The Creepy Casefiles of Margo Maloo, and Breakfast of the Gods. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Webcomics. I'm Derek.
And I'm Sean, and you're listening to two guys with advanced degrees talking about webcomics.
And on this month's episode, we're going to be looking at 3 webcomics, as we always do, 2 that are current and ongoing, and 1 that is already completed. We're going to begin with Karl Kerschl's The Abominable Charles Christopher. After that, we're going to look at The Creepy Casefiles of Margo Maloo by Weing. And then we're going to wrap up with the already completed comic, Breakfast of the Gods by Brendan Douglas Jones. But before we get to those webcomics, we want to tell all of you guys that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials will be at 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes at 50% off cover, but often you can find discounts that go higher than that.
And we also have to put in a nice plug for their sister website, mydigitalcomics.com, where you can get, not surprisingly, a lot of your favorite comics digitally if you prefer not having to fill up your library and bookshelves with lots of dead trees. As always, you can earn 5% towards your DCBS purchases if you purchase there, and they have a lot of your favorite titles as well. I've been looking lately through a lot of their Valiant stuff. They've got the Harbinger series and Ivar and Archer and Armstrong and all the other favorites out there. So mydigitalcomics.com is a great source for DCM free comics to get on your hard drive instead of your bookshelves.
That's right. So whether it's mydigitalcomics.com or dcbservice.com, you can't go wrong with those guys. That's dcbservice.com and mydigitalcomics.com. Go there for all of your hard copy and digital comics needs. And after you do get your stuff there, please send them an email and tell them that Sean and Derek sent you. Well, Sean, how have things been going with you, my friend?
Well, they have been busy around here lately. We're starting to get into convention season, and it seems like we've got one almost every weekend these days. You and I were just talking earlier. You've got Heroes Con coming up this weekend. Mm-hmm. I was just at Cake this past weekend, and Gene Kannenberger and I are presenting at another local fan con is called here in Arlington Heights, Chicago area, doing that this weekend too. So there's lots going on, just trying to keep up with all the everything.
Yeah, and about a week and a half ago, I was at Dallas Fan Expo.
Yeah.
So yeah, it tis the con season.
Yeah, and you know what? It's funny too. Is I've seen this for the past couple of years, but I've been seeing more and more people, the creators who are going to these shows and tabling at these shows. They're getting exhausted by, June, July. They can't make it all the way through September or anything like that. They're just wiping themselves out, going from show to show to show to show to show. Mm-hmm. And that's what you got to do to earn money, right? But it's tiring them out, I know.
Yeah, that's true. And, this is the webcomics episode, and so we would be remiss if we were talking about cons and didn't say anything about, webcomic creators who are at cons. Mm-hmm. At the cons that I go to, more times than not, it's a rarity that I see more than, let's say, 3 or 4 creators who have some kind of webcomic, either currently or in the past. I just don't see as many. Is that the similar experience that you have?
I think I say more than that, but I think that has a lot to do with the fact that we've got so many cons in the Chicago area, and Chicago has such a large contingent of comic creators. From my discussions with various creators over the years, is the problem they end up having is they try to go to as many shows as they can, but they have a smaller budget than a lot of the print creators. They just don't, there's some people making good bucks out of webcomics, but not a lot of them. So they're using their limited funds and trying to hit as many different shows as they can, which means that they tend to be a little bit more local, something that you can drive to. So I do see a fair amount of them here in the Chicago area, but it start getting a little farther afield than that, not as much, yeah.
Yeah, and also some of the cons that I tend to go to when I'm in Texas, in Dallas, or I guess places that I could drive to, like Austin or San Antonio, more times than not, those are larger pop culture conferences or conventions like Wizard World or Fan Expo. And so I think they're going to pull in fewer webcomic creators. I mean, there's some, but just not as many. And maybe they're there, I'm just not noticing.
No, I will definitely say a lot of those larger shows, again, your Wizard Worlds or Reed Pop shows or whatever, there will be, or at least in the ones I've been to, there usually are at least a couple, but not very many. You go to your the smaller shows, though, and the percentage, I think, of webcomic creators rises significantly. It's the small local shows are too small for Neil Adams to show up at, but close enough that the guy down the street doing his little webcomic that nobody's heard of is happy to do.
See, I thought that now Neil Adams was at almost every single convention possible. I mean, no matter how large or small, I see him everywhere. So, or maybe he's like Santa Claus. Maybe there are many people who are going around looking like Neil Adams.
I was always kind of assumed it was more of a Flash or Superman kind of thing. He's just moving so fast that it looks like there's multiple Neil Adams at different locations. But, it's kind of like that old Carmine Infantino after image effect,
Okay, well, whether we see web creator or webcomic creators at cons or not, we definitely have them to discuss on this month's episode. And we're going to get started with our first webcomic, and that is The Abominable Charles Christopher. This is written and drawn by Karl Kerschl, and Karl Kerschl has also done a lot of work on Assassin's Creed, Superman, The Flash, Teen Titans. He's also the co-creator of Gotham Academy. And so, in fact, I think Gotham Academy is winding down now or just recently.
I think so. Honestly, it's not one that I follow very closely. So
yeah, but this is a very different kind of webcomic, not something that you would see in the DC universe. And if you want to check this out, and maybe as you listen to this episode, follow along, go to abominable.cc. That's Abominable, ABOMINABLE.cc. And this is a webcomic that it's current and ongoing, but it's been around for quite a while. The first installment was in June of 2007. It's like a lifetime ago in terms of webcomics.
Yeah, he has been working on this for quite a while, yeah. But one of the things I think part of that is because he's very conscious of setting the tone and mood for this, right? He's got a lot of updates that are just, quiet moments to kind of sit back and reflect, and the characters are just kind of not even saying anything. He's got several updates that just don't go with any words of dialogue at all, right? Just kind of scene setting or tone setting.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this is definitely a very carefully crafted and carefully mapped out narrative. So, I mean, it's nothing slapdash at all. And there are going to be, for instance, if you look in the archives, you're going to find some stretches of time that his updates were fairly frequent. Others where they were much less frequent. And then there was a stretch of over a year between December 2014 and May of this year. There was nothing at all. And in fact, if you go to the website now, you're going to find on the right-hand side of the screen, on the bulletin board, a note that he put up that suggests as much. In fact, he writes, "Wait, is this a dream? A new Abominable comic? It's not a dream. I finished my run as artist of Gotham Academy, and I've begun work on a new series called Isola, which will be published by Image Comics next year. But the upside of all this is that I have time to resume work on Charles Christopher. So follow me on Twitter or Tumblr or Facebook or whatever is convenient for you, and I'll update you every time a new strip goes live." So, I really like that, the fact that he is upfront with his fans as to why he didn't have the time to update for over a year. But he says that I'm back, and if you follow me on one of these social media platforms, then you can keep up with whenever a new installment goes up, or even these long stretches where he doesn't have the time to put up anything.
And to his credit, too, when he first went on hiatus, the year and a half ago, whatever it was, as I recall, he had a note up at that time as well, alerting his readers to saying, listen, I've got to take some time off here to work on this Gotham Academy thing. I won't be able to update this for the foreseeable future. So he's not leaving his readership in the lurch at any point. He's very active in letting them know what's going on in terms of his scheduling and his updates.
Yeah, and also something like that is perfectly understandable. I mean, the guy's got to make a living, and he may make a few cents here or there on this webcomic, but, that's not going to pay the bills. Working for DC, writing, Gotham Academy, working on Superman, working on The Flash or Teen Titans, that's going to bring in the bucks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But, this is he keeps coming back to this, though, even after, like we said, a year and a half or so, which shows, I think, it highlights one of the interesting things about webcomics is that he really loves this story. He really loves what he's doing here, because that's not the type of thing that you would just leave sit for a year and a half and then come back to if you didn't love that. Right.
Exactly. And I mean, you can tell, by reading this strip, how invested he is in this, how much he loves the story. And it's okay if he takes his time doing it because he wants to make sure that it's done right. And that does come across in the story and in the art.
Well, yeah, that was actually going to be my next point, is that it very much comes across in the art, because the art across the board is absolutely gorgeous. Mm-hmm. It's very realistically rendered throughout the entire thing. He's got these very lush backgrounds with lots of trees and forests and waterfalls and that kind of thing. And all of the creatures, the animals, are very realistically depicted. Especially, you've got all these woodland creatures with lots of fur, and he's drawing pretty much all of the fur,
Right.
So he's putting a lot of time and effort just into the illustration alone, which I think is quite laudable.
Okay, well, let's share with our readers what the Abominable Charles Christopher is all about.
That's a little not as easy as a thing to say as you might expect. The basic story, of course, is about this abominable snowman, or a Sasquatch, or a Yeti, or whatever you want to call him, named Charles Christopher.
Thus the title, right? Pretty straightforward there. And he's kind of going through and has a quest of some kind. The problem, or not problem, I guess, but the challenge perhaps for readers is that the main character doesn't actually speak. I don't know if that's by choice or he just doesn't have the capacity for whatever reason, but he doesn't speak, and there's no overarching omniscient narrative to tell you what he's doing necessarily. Right.
So you're reliant on other characters' dialogue to figure out what he's doing. So he's on this quest, but then as he's going along on this quest, he's going through the woods, he's going through the mountains, and he's interacting with these other animal woodland creatures who all do have the power of speech, like a Disney cartoon, right? Like Bambi or something, right? And they're going about their business, and he often takes these little side trips with the story and goes off and does Kerschl does, yes, I'm sorry. He takes these little side trips with the story and talks about, okay, here's just a little day in the life of the raccoon family, or here's a little day in the life of the toads, or here's a little weird interaction with some birds. And he has these little sidebars that have no real, at least to my perception, direct bearing on the primary story, but there are these interesting little character asides. Some of them are funny, some of them are just charming, but they show up frequently enough that you can't not mention that, but they're not part of this main story of Charles Christopher going on this weird little quest that we know very little about. Even several years on, we still don't have a very strong sense of what that is. He's gone to this mountain. He's awakened this kind of old god of some kind, but for what reason and to what end, we don't really know at this point.
You know, that it's interesting the way you're describing this, because after reading The Abominable Charles Christopher, and by the way, the last page that we've gotten was put up on June 10th, so just last week, or just about 5 days ago as we record this. You know, I get the main storyline is of Charles Christopher, his quest, his encounter with this young king, what goes on with a young king, his interactions with other woodland creatures. But, you know, I'd be hard-pressed, even though that's the titular storyline, I'd be hard-pressed to say that that's the primary storyline, because there are many other stories that are intertwined throughout. And some of these are, let's say, just done in one, almost like a gag strip, you know, where you have the 5 or 6 or however many panels installment, and that's it, right? Kind of a quick in and out. Observational humor sometimes is touching. Sometimes, you know, it could be a text-free page, which does more to set the mood than anything. But many times it focuses on one of a number of different storylines that are interwoven throughout. Now, one of those, and I guess one of the most prominent, and the only one that I can remember that actually does have a title, and that is the story of Vival and Moonbear. And Vival is a bear that we're introduced fairly early on in this webcomic, but then he has a backstory with this, I don't know if we want to call it like a spiritual bear or a ghost bear, but another bear called Moonbear. And so this tells us a little bit about where Vival came from and his association with Moonbear. But there are a variety of other storylines that occur in this webcomic as well. And in fact, there are long stretches where we do not see Charles Christopher, the Yeti or the Abominable Snowman, at all.
Yeah. It's interesting. I guess it's almost like the Charles Christopher character in his quest is almost just kind of, I guess, an overarching narrative to hang all of these other pieces off of. Right. And we don't. I don't know that you could do one without the other necessarily. I don't. Even though a lot of these kind of one-off strips and these little side trips and whatever don't seem to relate to the again, I'm going to call it the primary narrative, as a titular narrative might be more apt, I guess. But I don't know that they hold together as well without having this kind of backstory of Charles Christopher going on his thing, and that you kind of have a sense of this world that you're moving in and out of. You know, you're seeing a lot of these little vignettes of, you know, otters and snakes and turtles and all these other creatures, but they don't really have very much significance outside of the fact that it's a character that Charles Christopher has encountered at some point.
Right, or it's a creature that inhabits the same general area that Charles Christopher inhabits, even though he may not have met them yet.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah. And, you know, now tell me if I'm off base here, but when I was reading this, I couldn't help but think of Burke Breathitt's Bloom County. And the
Really?
reason, yeah, well, first and foremost, is because some of these animals, right? I mean, we don't have an opus or an opus-like character, but the fact that we do have some creatures who talk, I think that's one of the first things that reminded me of that. But also in the old Bloom County, you would have various storylines that could be going on at the same time. And sometimes that Breathitt would focus on one for a while, but then he'd switch over to another. Or if not necessarily storylines, then at least certain characters that he would tend to focus on, at one point and then shift to another character. We may have a series or a week's worth of opus stories. Then it may shift over to several days on Steve Dallas. Or then, we have a week devoted to Maloo and his closet. Right? So, in other words, there are different stories and different characters that are all a part of the same world, but depending on wherever you pick up Bloom County, it may or may not be focusing on, a more coherent ongoing storyline from one month to the next, let's say. Now, it's very different, and I know this is not like a newspaper strip, but in reading The Abominable Charles Christopher, for some reason I just kept thinking of Bloom County.
Yeah, I can see your thinking on that. I didn't see that. I think largely because of a very different tonal quality to it. Breathitt was, even though he was switching stories up, he still was doing a newspaper strip and ended every day with a gag of some sort, right? Whereas Charles Christopher here, we've got a lot more seriousness involved, right? There's some jokes in there and some comedy bits and some just kind of slice of life pieces here too that are kind of amusing. But there's, I think the overarching story, I think in terms of just the volume of what's presented, is not really a comedy.
Right. And in fact, I think now that you mention that, well, first and foremost, you're right to point out the tonal difference, that this is a more somber or dramatic or serious comic, The Abominable Charles Christopher, than Bloom County. And also, you definitely don't have the satire, the political edge, and the gag emphasis that you have with Bloom County. But there are moments in The Abominable Charles Christopher, and even some of the storylines, and I'm thinking in particular of the one, and I can't remember what kind of bird it is, but the one where the father bird... he always wants to go out, leave the nest, have a drink, hang out with the guys, the guy birds. But his wife always gives him a guilt trip about it. You have to stay home with me and the kids. And that has that kind of Bloom County-esque sense of humor. And there are a few other things in Abominable Charles Christopher that are very similar, but I think that's the primary storyline that I'm thinking of, the one with the bird family. And that does have more of a feel of something that you would find in a Bloom County character.
Yeah, and there's actually the one less recurring, but still a recurring character / gag that I like that could follow into that same idea is Albino Mike. I don't know if you... he only shows up a handful of times, but there'll be some this...
Oh, that's right. Oh, yeah, Albino... I can't even talk. Albino Mike.
That's the guy. He just shows up a handful of times, but in kind of, this wacky... Where the heck did that come from? Break some of the tension of the moment with some humor type of element. And I kind of like the... out of left field absurdity of that just showing up, and to Kerschl's credit too, he uses it infrequently enough that it's always kind of a delightful surprise, and it's not something that gets overused and predictable. Yeah,
exactly, and it's to the point that he uses it so infrequent that I would forget about it until I saw Albino Mike, and I go, "Oh yeah, that's right, I remember that character."
Yeah. That's one of the ones that's one of the little standouts for me in terms of the little comedy bits. But I think that says a lot towards Kerschl's overall storytelling, right? Is the fact that he can do that. He can switch things up with these dramatic moments, with these comedy moments, with these, sight gags, with, he's done some verbal puns and visual and wordplay on occasion. That he's able to kind of blend all those together in a coherent story at all. is pretty impressive, I think, and one of the marks of a good storyteller, I think.
Right. Another part of his narrative, if we want to call it that, pattern in the Abominable Charles Christopher is these various, character profiles that we get throughout. And we find this more frequent in, the past couple of years, or the past couple of years where he's been actually putting out the webcomic. In fact, there at times there are stretches where you'll have several installments in a row that is a profile of a particular character. And some of these are characters we've already seen in the webcomic, and then some we haven't seen them at all. Like you'll have one for a squid. I'm looking at one right now for Moses, which is a common octopus, so not squid. And so you get a little information about him. Age, 6 months. Size, 0.4 meters. Weight, favorite food, neighborhood, number of hearts, so on and so forth. And that was a little different at first, but it didn't strike me as too unusual because I saw them as characters, the early ones of the story, or characters that I expected to see later on in the webcomic as it developed. But like, for instance, with the example of the octopus that I just mentioned, Moses, he doesn't appear anywhere in the webcomic. And so I'm wondering about the increased frequency of these kind of character sketches.
My guess is that those are his way of providing an update relatively quickly when he doesn't have time to focus on an actual strip, right? Mm-hmm. Because for all of these, there's really just the one illustration, right, of the character, maybe a little bit of a background, and a handful of text. And my guess is that, when he was first thinking up this idea for the strip, and when he was first working on it, he's got a notebook with just tons of character sketches in it, and he's got in his head this whole world mapped out of everything, all these different characters he could use and that might be interesting. And if Charles Christopher comes across this type of environment or needs this kind of interaction, he's got an elephant character or a squid character or a sloth character or whatever he needs kind of at the ready in his back pocket. And I think what Kerschl is doing then is presenting these characters a little bit more fleshed out, perhaps, than the original notebook sketches, but doing that as a way to put an update out there that's not as time-consuming as putting together a 6 or 8 or 10 panel strip that's trying to advance a dialogue or advance a narrative. This is just something he can throw up real quickly. He's got maybe an hour to put something together, which isn't enough time to do the whole strip, but something that's kind of interesting, entertaining, and still ties in with the overall story.
Right, and another thing that I got out of these character profiles, even though they're not characters of any of the storylines that we have in this webcomic, it's his love of animals, or at least drawing the animals. I mean, and that comes out clearly. You were talking about the more realistic style of art that we see in the Abominable Charles Christopher, and this definitely comes out with the various creatures, the birds, the mammals, the amphibians that he draws, and even the fish. Again, even characters that we will probably never see in any of the stories here, when the various profile pieces. He just loves to draw animals, and he does it so well.
Well, I think it goes to a love of not just drawing animals, but of animals and nature in general. He's there's a few points, not major plot points or story points, but there's a few spots in the storyline where he provides almost a commentary on hunting or animal trapping or that kind of thing. There was a short sequence where a rabbit was just kind of hopping through the woods and stumbled across a bear trap, basically, and right. Charles Christopher had to kind of save him and get him out of there, and then he just took a club and started beating on this inanimate bear trap because he was pissed at it, right? And so I think I think Kerschl has this kind of respect for nature and appreciation of nature and animals in general, beyond just hey, this is really cool to draw.
Right. Yeah, and there are moments of this webcomic that it becomes almost Zen-like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and it's kind of its peacefulness. It's almost, I mean, in some of the sketches that he creates, a sense of calm peacefulness.
and the character of Charles Christopher, I think, exemplifies that too, right? I mean, it's like I said, the character's mute in the first place, but then he also has he's still, obviously, you're able to draw a lot of character inferences out of him just by his actions, and they seem a little bit more innocent and more naive, almost not quite naive, but
I'd say naive with some things.
With something, sure.
Yeah. And innocent is a very good word because he doesn't have it anymore, but when this strip first began, he had a pacifier. Now, how an abominable snowman or a yeti gets a pacifier, who knows? But, you see many pictures of him with a pacifier, which shows this very innocent side to him. Now, he loses it, I can't remember where, but he loses it at some point. We don't see him with it, over now what maybe like the majority of the webcomic. But you can see in the banner at the very top of the page, no matter where you are in this webcomic, an image of him with a pacifier.
Yeah. And like you said, the initial strips, if you go back to the beginning and start reading from the very start, a lot of those early ones show him with that as well.
Right. Now, the Abominable Charles Christopher is available in 2 volumes so far. And so, in fact, if you go to the webcomic and click on store, you'll find that you can, and I'm assuming you can still get this, volume 1 of the book and then the second volume. And I can't remember when the second volume came out, but it's been a while. So I'm assuming that every so often he's going to put out just another volume of this book. And from what I see on the store page now, there's a soft cover still available for volume 1. And for volume 2, you could get it in either soft cover or hardcover, and you can also get it in French.
That's an interesting challenge, and I've seen a few other creators do that kind of thing where they're able to present their comic in multiple languages. Some people are able to do that through crowdsourcing, and they basically have what amounts to a very devoted fan who says, "Hey, you know what? I also know Spanish, or I also know French, or I also know German. You mind if I translate this so my friends can read it too?"
Well, Kerschl's Canadian, so he could be bilingual.
Well, that was what I was going to say next. Is you've got somebody like Kerschl who is probably bilingual and can work in both languages. I think we saw that also last month with Power Nap. I think there's a Spanish version as well because they're Mexican by birth, and they're able to kind of go back and forth between the languages very easily, or a lot easier than I could, certainly.
Yeah. We should also mention that the Abominable Charles Christopher won an Eisner Award in 2011 for Best Digital Comic, even though this is a webcomic and not a digital comic, as our listeners well know. Although, this raises an interesting issue. I don't want to, really say much more about this outside of right now in passing. But, one of the problems with the Eisners, especially this category of digital comic, now they define that category as webcomic or digital comic. I think it's just a mistake to conflate the two or to combine the two now.
Yeah.
They need to update their categories. And in fact, Kunka and I were discussing that on an episode from last month. We were looking at this year's Eisner Award nominees.
Yeah, and a lot of the other awards do something similar, right? I think the Rubens have a similar kind of category where
they put the digital and webcomic together.
Yeah, and they just they lump everything that's not printed up in one category, and I don't think that ever works. Again, not to go off on too far down that rabbit hole, but there are so many different types of digital comics, so many different types of webcomics. The experience reading a digital comic versus reading a webcomic is totally different. It makes no sense to me to conflate the two.
Different delivery systems, different platforms, different means of consumption, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense to me. But Onward and Upward. I expect at some point they will get broken out. The fact that they even have them, I mean, that's still a relatively recent development, right? They didn't have awards for digital or webcomics. I think those were introduced like 6 or 8 years ago, something like that. And those were that struck me at the time as being way overdue even then. So they're I think they're moving on that. I think they'll eventually get to breaking things out into different categories, but they're not the speediest group in that sense.
Mm. Well, if you want to read a good webcomic, definitely check out the Abominable Charles Christopher. And again, the URL is abominable.cc. So the next webcomic that we're going to be looking at is the Creepy Casefiles of Margo Maloo. And this is drawn and written by Weing. And I guess we're pronouncing that last name correctly. It's Weing. And in fact, you can find this webcomic at drewweing.com. So that's DREWWEING.com. And this began not too long ago, in February of 2014, and the last installment, I think, went up on Tuesday, because this is normally updated on Tuesdays and Thursdays as we record this. So the most recent page went up on the 14th.
Yeah. And he has been, from what I can tell, very consistent with his updates.
Right.
I think he took a little time off between the first story and the current story. But, once he gets started with, one of these stories, he's there every Tuesday and Thursday. I didn't see or recall any instances aside from between the stories where he missed one of those updates.
Exactly. Now, you mentioned the different stories. Right now, the Creepy Casefiles of Margo Maloo we're into the chapter 4. So the first chapter that introduced us to everything is called City of Monsters, and then the second chapter, which began in July of 2014, was The Ghost in the Post. And then the third one, which began February of last year, The Ogre's Baby. And then the current chapter, which began in December of 2015, Panic in the Attic. And that's where we are right now. So, how would we introduce the Creepy Casefiles of Margo Maloo to the uninitiated?
Yeah, well, it's about this, obviously, character called Margo Maloo, but she's introduced through more of an everyman character. Charles Thompson, I think, is the kid's name. And it's just a young boy. I don't think it's given an actual age at any point, but young boy, his family moves to the big city. Dad's bought a big house and some property that he's going to rent out. He's going to renovate and rent out to people. And Charles here is trying to adjust to his life in this new space, in this new city. And in the process, he comes into contact with this Margo Maloo character, who he first encounters because he is concerned about a monster in his closet, basically.
Yeah.
And more so than, your typical kid imagining, dark shadows and that kind of thing.
Yeah, he's not imagining this.
Yeah, there is in fact a monster in his closet. And so he enlists the help of Margo Maloo, another child of indeterminate age, but certainly pretty young, as an investigator to kind of do an X-Files type of situation at a kid level. So it might be something along the lines of I hesitate to go to a Scooby-Doo reference, but it's not that far off from the idea.
Right. It's funny because you mentioned Scooby-Doo. For some reason, I was going to mention the old Night Stalker TV series with Darren McGavin, right?
Sure.
But the difference between Scooby-Doo and Kolchak, the Night Stalker, is that they investigate monsters and supernatural creatures, but they do so in order to get rid of them, right? Now, the thing with Margo Maloo is that she doesn't investigate, she doesn't try to get rid, she understands, she knows many of these monsters. And so one of the things she is able to do is to, help preserve the anonymity of the monsters, to work with them, and to help people who may, kind of like our protagonist Charles, stumble across them and be freaked out. And in fact, you're right. I mean, that's how we are first introduced to Margo, in that, Charles comes to town, and they had been living in this kind of podunk town somewhere, but now they moved to the big city, which is called Echo City. So for all practical purposes, it's like a New York or a Chicago. And Charles is resistant at first. He doesn't like the move. He doesn't like where they are. As you mentioned, his father buys this really big and old house. He's renovating it. It's big. It's creepy. It has a lot of dark corners. It's rather gothic. He definitely sees monsters. But what Charles has as an outlet, and this becomes important as the story develops, is a blog. And in fact, he maintains a blog that he thinks is, has a large readership, but it really doesn't. But he writes primarily about kids' rights. And how kids are looked down upon and they need to be taken more seriously. But when he first starts to learn about this, this underworld of monsters that, is outside of the line of vision of everyone else, especially the adults, and he meets Margo, he wants to start writing about these monsters. But Margo says, no, you cannot write about this. You cannot let people know, especially adults, because then the monsters will get in trouble. They won't have any place to go. Again, she understands them. She empathizes with them, and she's there to help them, the monsters.
Yeah, but at the same time, making sure that the kids are okay too. But
the kids are all right.
The kids are all right, exactly. But in service of, but to your point, in service of the monsters. So what happens is a lot of these monsters that she is dealing with are often children themselves, and aren't familiar with all of the social mores of monsterdom that basically prevent the monsters from interacting with the rest of human society. And there are evidently a lot of rules in place that, monsters can't let people actually see them, except for kids is maybe kind of okay because nobody believes kids anyway. And that's kind of where Charles comes in, is he's, like you said, he's already talking and interested in this notion of children's rights and advocating on a child's behalf. And that ties into what Margo's doing by, she's advocating for these monsters' rights, they have some kind of a tacit agreement with children that precludes any kind of dealings with adults. So there's this interesting little dynamic going on between Margo and Charles and the Monster Society in general. Charles wants to find it because of his interest in children's rights. He's wants to learn more about this and figure out what these tacit agreements are. He wants to help Margo, who's one of the few people he actually knows in the city now. There's a lot of good interaction and reason for being. That was kind of always the problem with a Scooby-Doo type of show, is you had these 5 characters. What the hell were they doing together?
Yeah.
We never really got a good sense of why, Velma was hanging out with Shaggy and Daphne and Fred, or any of that combination there.
You just accepted it.
You just kind of had to accept that and run with it. Here we've got a little bit more, a better sense of characters that these people are together for a reason, and Margo isn't completely accepting of Charles at first, and she's like, yeah, I'm not sure if I can trust you, and it ends up being a lot more character driven than just a typical let's investigate monsters story that you might find.
Yeah, and she eventually comes around to where she will allow him to write about their adventures with the monsters, with this caveat that he has to make sure that he puts some kind of gateway on his blog. In other words, there has to be age verification, but it's in the opposite direction as we normally think of the web and age verification, right? So you have to be under a certain age in order to access his blog.
Right, and that's, again, going back to the notion that, that there's that tacit agreement between the monsters and children, is that, the adults can't find out about this. And
right.
As I recall, there was some reference in there were some dire repercussions if that would be the case, but I don't recall any specifics to that effect. But yeah, again, it was okay for the children to find out because nobody believes them anyway.
Right. Now, if what Sean and I are describing to you sounds like an all-age comic, well, this is an all-age webcomic.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, this is. I mean, I wouldn't call this a webcomic for young readers, but in a more appropriate way, all age, because I think that adults could appreciate this quite a bit. It is a sophisticated narrative, but at the same time, a very young reader can put this up on the web browser and get a big kick out of it.
Yeah, and the story isn't so sophisticated, or at least the broader plot is not so sophisticated that a young reader couldn't follow along easily, right?
Right. They
might miss some of the nuance or some of the social commentary on, children's rights and that kind of thing. But, the fact of, they're investigating monsters and here's this creature that lives in my closet and, that kind of thing is something very relatable that they can follow along with very easily.
Right. And, the art has definitely a kind of an all-age feel to it because it does look quite cartoony. I mean, you could see this is the kind of art that would definitely have a home in, let's say, daily or Sunday strips.
Yeah, I could totally see that. Which actually strikes me as very interesting because when I was first made aware of Drew Weing in the first place was that he had a book that was published by, I want to say, Fantagraphics back in 2014 called Set to See. Was that? I'm drawing a blank on if it really was Fantagraphics. Yes, it was. And that was a lot more adult storyline, and it was a lot more. It still had a cartoony flavor to it, but there was a lot more depth into the drawing. And so, when I first heard about and looked at Margo Maloo, I was expecting something similar to that, and it's it's still very well done, but very well done in a very different way than Set to See was, which I think is very interesting direction to take things creatively. He's not, trying to do like Frank Miller. Anytime you see a Frank Miller piece, it's a Frank Miller piece.
Right.
A John Byrne story, you always know it's a John Byrne type of story. But this is what is significantly different from what he did in Set to See, and I think that's very interesting to do creatively, and I think it certainly speaks a lot to his artistic chops that he's able to switch things up like that with apparent relative ease.
Right. Now, Set to See, the hardcover came out in fall or I guess late summer of 2010. As we mentioned a little while ago, Margo Maloo first began in 2014. Do you know if this is Weing's first webcomic, or has he done other webcomics before the current one?
This is the first one to my knowledge.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you found out about him through the book and then this webcomic.
Yeah, I had purchased the book whenever it came out, or shortly thereafter, and it was one of those where I think it actually, I want to say it at least was nominated for a couple of awards if it didn't win anything. And it was kind of one of those that was like, okay, I picked it up because it was recommended by several people and read it and was like, wow, this is really cool. This is different. And so then later I started hearing about this Margo Maloo thing, and by the same guy, and I was like, oh, this is the guy that did that thing. I'll pick this up. I'll try and look at this. And then when it finally started, it was, like I said, significantly different. Not bad, just different. And it was, but yeah, I was first made aware of Drew's work through Set to See, which was, like I said, a few years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I definitely have to check out Set to See now that I've read the Creepy Casefiles of Margo Maloo. But yeah, I think Margo Maloo is a great webcomic. Again, if you guys want to check this out, we strongly recommend that you do so. It's at Drew Weing, DREWWEING.com.
Sorry, Drew, there are too many W's in that. We need to take out at least one or two, I think. But no, seriously, good comic, worth checking out.
Okay, now we come to our already completed webcomic of the month, and this is an interesting one, I have to say. When you suggested this, I looked it up and go, oh my God, I'm going to love this one. For anyone who loved breakfast cereal, especially breakfast cereal commercials growing up, then this is for you. It's called Breakfast of the Gods by Brendan Douglas Jones, and you can find it at breakfastofthegods.com. So that's one word, breakfastofthegods.com. This one was completed quite a number of years ago in January 2010. But, Sean, I'm not exactly sure when it began. You and I were talking before we started recording, and I don't think you can... I wasn't able to find the start date and year on the website itself.
Yeah, because I think what happened was, and my memory's a little fuzzy on this, but I think what happened was he had actually started that on another location. I don't think it has always been at that breakfastofthegods.com. So he started that up, ran through for however long it took, 2 or 3, 4 or 5 years. And then after it was completed, or very near the end of when it was completed, then switched it over to this breakfastofthegods.com and re-uploaded the entire strip to that site, which then screws up all the dates on the whole thing, right? So if you go through, I think it looks like everything was uploaded in 2010, which is not the case. It was a strip that ran for at least several years beforehand. I couldn't find an exact date, but I do know it was at least 3 or 4 years before that, before 2010.
Right, but it was completed in January of 2010 because it says so on the very front page. Now, one of the things we haven't really said much of anything about this month is the design or the layout of the various webcomic sites. I think with both the Abominable Charles Christopher and the Creepy Casefiles of Margo Maloo, those sites are pretty easy to navigate. They're not that complex. Neither of those sites have a lot of different pages or options. It's more or less straightforward, right? You can navigate through. Both of them have archives. I know that you can find like a store with Kerschl's website. But other than that, that's basically what you find here. Now, what you said earlier, that Breakfast of the Gods had probably been at another location, then in 2010, Jones uploaded everything. And the fact that this was completed, about 6 years ago, does make sense because this website has, how do I put this, an older feel to it. And what I mean by that, it's not near as easy to navigate as the other two we've been discussing.
Yeah. And the additional challenge, or one of the additional challenges with this site is you can still go through and see page by page, each update, but then it's just small enough that you can't quite read all the text until you click on the actual thumbnail. It's a little larger than a thumbnail, but you click on the graphic again to get the larger full-scale version. And
you can read it more easily.
But then you have to you end up going back and forth between the large version and the small version for the navigation, which makes it a little awkward to kind of sit down and read through.
Right. And, one of the things I've mentioned a number of times on the webcomic series is I really do like it when you have in a webcomic the option of either tapping on a tablet or clicking on an image that'll take you to the next page, right? Instead of having to click next, or previous, I like to click on the image because it's easy to do so, right? You don't have to limit yourself to small text. Just, tap on or click on that really big image. If you do that, though, with Breakfast of the Gods, you're going to find a bigger image. And so navigating from page to page on Breakfast of the Gods is not the easiest thing to do. And in fact, when I first started reading this, it took me a while to realize that if I wanted to go to the next page, I could go to the text at the very bottom right of each current page to take me to the next. And it wasn't that apparent because it's smaller text. And again, that gets back to what I said a moment ago. This seems like an early type of blog or an early type of webcomic where it's just not as easy to navigate. But that's the way it was set up, and it's already completed, and so it's not as if Jones is going to go and update this much.
Right. And I think part of that, too, stems from, again, going back to, we're talking several years back now, so not only has the technology changed, but I think the thinking and the mindset of how to market a webcomic has changed in that time period too, right?
Right, how to market, how to design, all of that, yes.
Right. So, and I think back in the day, we're talking 10 years ago when this would have started, right? The thinking was more that you wanted to make it a little bit more difficult on the website to kind of coerce people to buy the book version, right? So I think that may have been part of the thinking, again, at the time. This is maybe a decade ago now, that, if I make this a little bit more challenging, you can still get to it and read everything online, but if you want to read the whole thing, it'd just be a hell of a lot easier if you just went over and bought it for, the trade paperback version and just get that.
Okay. Now, you talked about buying the book. I hope that if you go to Amazon.com, you can find this book because you can't do it through this website. And that's one of the things that was strange. One of the first options, I guess, in the right-hand column is buy the book. You click on that, it takes you to a not found message. And that's the same wherever you go on this site. That click-through does not work, so it's a dead end. And, I guess Jones needs to go back and, if nothing else, just update that so maybe he can sell a couple more books.
Well, the other possibility, too, is that he took that down deliberately. I know
then why not take that link down?
Well, it's that I don't know, but I know he expressed concern at some point, and I don't recall exactly when, of just the legality of it.
Oh, that's right, because of all the characters.
Right, and we should probably actually get into what the storyline is.
That's right, because our listeners are wondering what we're talking about. So how would you describe Breakfast of the Gods?
Breakfast of the Gods is actually it's a story. It's a kind of a war storyline almost, right? Is you have this kingdom with all these characters in it, and the kingdom next door, or not kingdom next door, but the castle next door. The inhabitant there wants to take over, so he gets his little army together and starts waging war on the kingdom, and the kingdom has to fight back.
Okay, you say he. Who is this he?
Well, yeah, I'm getting to that. That's
okay,
because that's the clever bit. So the storyline is kind of straightforward in that sense, right? And there's some nice little complexities with here he's got this double agent, and there's he's captured the one leader and using that as leverage, and so it's a clever, well thought out storyline. But then the interesting thing is that all of the characters that we're talking about, the kingdoms and these different people that are manipulating and fighting and everything, are mascots from breakfast cereals. Mm-hmm. So we have Tony the Tiger, Count Chocula, Frankenberry, Boo Berry, Captain Crunch, Cuckoo the Cuckoo Bird, every Toucan Sam, and I do mean literally every breakfast cereal mascot you've ever heard of is in this is in this story at some point. Obviously, some of the big guys that you know well show up more prominently, right? Tony the Tiger is kind of the general of the good guys. And Count Chocula is the bad guy who's trying to take things over with his army that includes Frankenberry, Booberry, the Fruit Mummy. I forget the character's name offhand, but that was that really weird version that didn't sell very well. But it's, basically it's a classic kind of good versus evil storyline. But what I think is interesting, and what Jones did very well, I think, is he's gone through and not only, pulled all these obscure characters out to showcase them in the storyline, but then he's essentially had to develop incredible characterization and backstory for each one.
Right.
So if you think about it, I mean, we've had Tony the Tiger has been around for decades now, but what do you really know about him as a character, right? He goes around, he's, very cheerful, very kind of heroic looking, and says that's great all the time, but you don't know anything about him beyond that, right? So what Jones does is he provides these elaborate characterizations and backstories for all of these characters. And the interesting thing is he's able to pull out enough little nuggets from those, 30-second commercials that he's able to develop a story that makes complete sense for that character from what you've seen on the commercials.
Exactly. Now, all of this, you talked about various kingdoms and realms and whatnot. Now, what Jones has done is he's created this world called Cerealia. Cerealia. And this is a region where basically you have an eternal morning, right? So it's never dark. It's always morning, like the first part of the day when people eat breakfast. And you're right. If you go through the Dramatis Personae page, then you can see, at least with a major character, a who's who of breakfast cereals. So, you mentioned, the aforementioned Captain Crunch, Count Chocula, Tony the Tiger, Frankenberry, but we also have Trix Rabbit, Sugar Bear, Lucky the Leprechaun, Cookie Jarvis is an important part. One of my favorites growing up, Boo Berry, Toucan Sam, and then some less known characters. For instance, Squish the Sogmaster. I could not remember that. I don't know if I encountered Squish the Sogmaster at all when I was a kid. I definitely remember Quisp and Quake because I was a big Quisp and Quake fan. Of course, there's Diggum. And then there are also some side characters, right? So you have Jean Lafoot, who I had forgotten that he was the big baddie with Captain Crunch. But he was. We also have Fruit Brute, Officer Crumb, Cookie Crook. I mean, the list goes on. And these are just some of the major characters. But, you're talking that – you mentioned that, Jones goes into almost every serial character ever created. And he does. And sometimes these characters aren't mentioned by name at all. And sometimes you may see them one or two times in passing, maybe in the background. What Jones has done is his homework, and it's not just going back to, let's say, YouTube and looking at a lot of the old breakfast cereal commercials, but also doing quite a bit of research elsewhere, doing his own kind of investigation. And one website that he credits with helping him a lot is actually a site that I was familiar with before, is Topher's Serial Character Guide. And this is a great website if you're not familiar with it. Again, it's Topher's, Topher'', Topher's Serial Character Guide. And this URL, it's, I guess if you go to www.lavasurfer.com/serial-guide.html, you'll find it. Or there's a link from the website breakfastofthegods.com. And what Topher does is he divides the various breakfast cereals primarily by company. So you have General Mills, Kellogg's, Post, Quaker Oats, Ralston, Nestle, Nabisco, and then smaller companies, but those are the main ones. And every now and again, I have found myself at this site for whatever reason, looking at some of these older serials, some of the characters involved. And so this is one of those sites, one of those resources that Jones used in creating this webcomic.
And yeah, and like you said, he pulls in everybody, and it's a lot of them are. What was interesting to me is, what the way my mother bought cereal when I was a kid was. We had our favorites, of course, and there were a handful of ones that we just wouldn't touch. But what? Well, because some of them were nasty. Let's be honest here. Some of those were really nasty.
Yeah, a lot of them are nasty. Yeah.
But we would vary between different boxes of cereal, right? So we didn't always get Frosted Flakes, right? Sometimes it was Frosted Flakes, sometimes it was Cocoa Pebbles, sometimes it was Fruit Loops. Depends on kind of what was on sale and what was available at that time. And so as I was going through and reading this story, of course, familiar again with Tony the Tiger, Captain Crunch, all the big guys, and then. What was always striking to me is coming across these obscure characters that just kind of tickled the back of your brain just enough to go, yeah, that looks familiar. Where the hell did I see that? Because you had that one box of cereal once back in 1976 or something, right?
Right.
And I think that was kind of interesting for me to kind of go through. And I couldn't tell you anything about that character other than that the visual looks familiar. And in a lot of cases, that's all you need, right? Because, Tony the Tiger has been around. Everybody knows Tony the Tiger. So, right. Of course, you're going to make him one of the main characters. Same with Count Chocula. Same with Captain Crunch. Quisp, I don't know, needs to be as main of a character, so...
oh no, Quisp was important. He's not only important to this webcomic, but he was an important breakfast cereal character. Okay, and I guess you and I are about the same age, but my prime cereal eating time in life is the 1970s.
Right.
I was around before 1970, definitely around after 1979. And I ate cereal in the 1980s, I guess, the early 80s. But the prime breakfast cereal time for me as a kid, the 1970s. And Quisp and Quake, that's when we first saw, I believe, Quisp and Quake. And, I remember eating a lot of Quisp especially.
See, that's one I don't remember actually ever having that for some reason.
Really? Okay, well, let me ask you this.
Anyway.
And we haven't really talked... Well, we've talked a little bit about the storyline. But, okay, in reading this, and to me, one of the most enjoyable parts of this webcomic, Breakfast of the Gods, is what you and I are doing right now, is reminiscing, remembering our childhood, and then doing a little investigation on places such as Topher's Cereal Character Guide, or even, for me, spending a lot of time recently on YouTube looking at a lot of these old commercials. And I think that's one of the joys you get from this webcomic is recalling all of this stuff, right? So let me ask you this, Sean. Mm-hmm. As you were reading this originally and then rereading it for this month's webcomic series,
yeah.
What cereal or cereal characters really stood out to you for not necessarily nostalgic reasons, or it could be, but that you have maybe the closest or best feeling about?
Well, in terms of the characters, I would probably go with Tony the Tiger, honestly. It is his characterization, I thought, with the story particularly, was there was a lot of development there, I think. Like I was saying earlier, if you sit back and you watch the whatever 50 or however many years of commercials, you don't get a whole lot out of it. It's a great character design, right? It's just a fantastic character design from years and years ago. That's why they're still using it. But there's not a lot of characterization there, not a lot of meat there. But what I think Jones does is makes him a fully rounded, three-dimensional character. And, he's put in the role of the hero, right? The primary hero. He's going to come in and save the day. And it's hard not to like and appreciate that. And Frosted Flakes was one of my go-to cereals, right? It was on that got...
You know why? They're great.
I didn't even set you up for it. Wasn't even trying to set you up for that one. But yeah, I thought that one was really well done, and I really liked that character. The other one that stood out to me was Sugar Bear, actually. and not so much. I mean, I didn't eat the cereal as much for whatever reason. I did like it. I don't know why we didn't have it more, but probably because it wasn't on sale as much. But but what he did with the characterization on Sugar Bear, I thought was also very interesting and dramatic. And I don't want to give anything away from the story, but there's some dark elements to that character that I think make for very interesting reading, especially when he's playing off of Tony the Tiger, right? There's where Tony is more the traditionally heroic character. Sugar Bear is a lot more reluctant of a hero.
Right.
And they have some kind of past that's kind of alluded to a few times.
Right. And Jones, and without giving too much away, I think the connection that Jones makes with Sugar Bear and kind of complicating his story is linking it to a superhero like the Hulk.
Right.
He even mentions this at one point in one of the annotations.
Yeah, and I think it's done very well. I mean, there's even if you use the Hulk as kind of a template or model, or if you want to go back to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde or whatever, something along that kind of split personality idea, he does some very interesting things with that, and especially again the kind of the interplay not only the character itself, but the interplay with him and specifically Tony the Tiger, I think is very good.
Yeah. Now, see, it's interesting when I ask you what characters or what serials really stood out the most to you in reading this webcomic. You mentioned not only two of the most prominent characters in this webcomic, but especially in the case of Tony the Tiger, one of the most famous serial characters. Mm-hmm. For me, what really resonated were the characters who weren't near as prominent in this webcomic and are now all but forgotten by even older serial eaters, but definitely are maybe unknown by younger people who love breakfast cereal. Now, Quake is one of those. Like I said, I ate a lot of Quake as a kid, and I like the character, the little space alien with the little propeller beanie thing going on. Mm-hmm. I really liked him. But to me, the biggest find in this comic, or the serial or the characters that meant the most to me were the Freakies. Oh. I grew up loving Freakies. Okay. In fact, I remember quite a bit of that commercial, or at least one of the commercials. We are the Freakies, we are the Freakies, this is a freaky tree. We never miss a meal, 'cause we love a cereal. And in fact, the Freakies tree, the Freakies are not that prominent in this webcomic, but the Freakies tree is, because this is where we see everybody gathered at the very beginning, and it's where we see characters congregating around later on, and I think we even see the Freakies tree at the very end. And underneath the Freakies tree is where many of the dead serial characters are buried. So, I mean, the Freakies play kind of a background role, but prominent nonetheless. So I really like that subtle treatment of the Freakies, but because I grew up loving Freakies, and I used to have almost all of those little freaky toys that you would get in the box, the little characters of the various Freakies. Okay, like 6 or 7 of them, and I lost them. I have no idea where they are. I would be overjoyed in life if I discovered where I hid those as a kid, or where my mother ended up putting them. I mean, she may have thrown them away for all I know.
They're buried in the backyard somewhere is where they are.
They could be, yeah. Under the Freaky tree.
Under the Freaky tree, exactly.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, to me, that was one of the most enjoyable. In fact, I went back to watch Freaky commercials as I was reading this. I was going to YouTube and specifically looking for Freakies commercials.
And have you been on eBay yet looking for those figures too?
No, I'm not going to go that far.
Well, okay, for any listeners out there, that's your job. Go to eBay, get the 6 or 7 of them that are out there, send them to Derek. He will love you for their eternity.
Yes. I will dedicate podcast episodes to you.
There you go.
Yeah. Now, okay, getting back to the webcomic itself. So Breakfast of the Gods, actually, this is told in 3 books, and Jones calls these books, not volumes. The first one's called The Last Good Morning. The second one, Oh Captain, My Captain, which I think is a great, clever title. And then the last book is titled Apocalypse Yum.
That's my favorite title, frankly.
Yeah. And as the titles suggest, there is quite a bit of humor in Breakfast of the Gods. I think Brendan Jones has an incredible sense of humor, very sharp wit, and the way that he uses these characters, sometimes overtly, but more times than not very subtly, I think is just genius.
But you know what's interesting, though, is despite that humor, he's playing the entire thing straight, right? He's not putting this up as, with these characters portrayed ironically or anything. He's just, this is a very straight, dramatic storyline. It has some humor to it. It's got some, it's like, a Joss Whedon story or something almost, right? It's got these, nice, large drama pieces, but then peppered with comedic elements to break up the tension a little bit.
Exactly, and there's never any condescending.
Yeah.
I mean, you can tell that he has an appreciation for breakfast cereal and the history of breakfast cereal. And we were mentioning earlier that, reading Karl Kerschl's The Abominable Charles Christopher, how he really has a great feel for nature, for animals and the natural world. You get the same thing with Jones and breakfast cereal.
Yeah, which is kind of a strange thing to say, but but he really, he does really have a wicked appreciation and knowledge of all that. There's, like I said, there were plenty of times when he was pulling out characters that I just was absolutely clueless on and had to look up, and other ones that were like flickering at the back of my memory somewhere. He pulled them all in, every last one of them.
Well, on that topic, let me ask you now. Did you read this originally when it was on whatever other site it was?
I think I probably started somewhere in the middle of the storyline, but yeah.
Okay, now correct me if I'm wrong, but this is my first time reading this.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm not mistaken, what seems to be the case is that, he re-uploaded this to this new site, breakfastofthegods.com, and so we have all three of the books out. And then when he started to put up everything, then it seemed as if he was going back and adding notes. In other words, he was putting annotations to the various installments, and he starts doing this in book one, of course, but he stops writing notes or putting in the annotations somewhere maybe 2/3 of the way through book one, or maybe toward the end of book one. And then we find no annotations. And so when I was reading this, I had thought, wow, does every single page of this webcomic have extensive, sometimes quite extensive, annotations with information about who these characters are, a little bit of the history of a particular character or of a breakfast cereal, in other words, quite a bit of context here. But then that peters out as we get toward the end of book one, and we have none of those annotations in book two and book three. Now, I'm wondering if Jones, little by little, if he's still doing this, is going to be putting up notes to each one of these pages, because I found the notes kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, I found it maybe a tad annoying because I wanted to get into the comic and enjoy it, right? And I didn't want to lose the rhythm, the pace of reading the story. On the other hand, the notes are quite valuable, and they tell you a lot that you would probably miss if you didn't have them. And so once I got toward the end of book one, I found myself really missing those notes and wishing that there had been notes all the way through.
To my recollection, and again, this is going back a few years, he would originally put up those notes as he uploaded each new page.
Oh, really? Originally he did?
Yeah. So those are, I don't think he wrote those specifically when he re-uploaded everything in 2010. I think, or he didn't write anything new when he re-uploaded those that in 2010. I think that was all stuff he pulled from his old site. I think, as I recall, I think he has notes for the entire book. He has annotations for everything. I suspect he just got distracted from uploading them to the site.
Okay, because I'm looking now. Yeah, I'm looking now at the archives, and the last time we see a note is page 26 of book one, and book one has 30 pages. So yeah, I was right. It toward the very end of book one is when all of a sudden the annotations are gone. And we don't have them in book 2, we don't have them in book 3. It made reading the story quicker and easier for me without all of the annotations. At the same time, I missed them, though. I mean, because I felt that I could have gotten so much more out of the individual panels, the pages, the images, especially the information that wasn't so obvious and some of the backstory of the characters in the serial itself without the annotations. I wish I had had them.
Yeah, and that, from my recollection, that was a benefit for me reading it originally, is that in the first place, it didn't break up the story flow at all because... Right, just the nature of coming out every week or 2 weeks or whatever the schedule was at the time, you're already inherently breaking up that story flow, right? You're not reading it as a complete narrative or a completed narrative because it wasn't complete yet, right?
Right.
So you would just read that day's update and then read his notes afterwards, and that was as far as you could get anyway. And I found it very useful. I know there was some of this stuff that I would never have looked up. Particularly towards the end of the book, when he starts pulling out all the stops on the characters.
Oh yeah, it gets really wild at the end.
Yeah, because he's got several of those panels towards the back of the book. There, he just it's the
battle royal.
It's the battle royale, and he pulls out the money shots, right? So we got a double page spread of like every character you've ever heard of, think of the best thing that Jack Kirby ever drew, but put in breakfast mascots. that kind of thing.
Kirby
right?
with breakfast mascots.
Yeah, exactly. It's that kind of thing. And there, like I said, there were a lot of characters that I just did not recognize, and I wouldn't have gotten anything at all out of if he did not have those notes there. Right? There would be characters that just did not connect at all because he goes back for the full history of breakfast cereal, right? So some of these characters were over and done with before I was born.
He makes some allusions to cereal in the early 20th century,
right? And I just wouldn't have even known what to look up in a lot of cases, right? You've got a character drawing that's not original to it's not like you could do a Google search on the box art or something, right? So you've got some kind of character sitting in the background that no one is actually naming. There's no way you could find that out if he didn't have those notes at the time. So he has, I'm sure he has notes written up for all of those pages. And my guess is he just never got around to uploading them all to the new site, which is unfortunate.
Now have you seen the book? Well, I mean, we can't see it on this website, of course, because the link is dead. But he had at one point a book available. Have you seen that at any point?
No, I do remember him. I remember considering it several times and considering hitting the purchase button on those several times. And as I recall, there was just I don't know, the air conditioner unit died that week or something.
Because I'm wondering if the notes
I do
were in
remember
the book.
I don't know. I don't recall honestly if he said anything to the effect of the notes being in the books or not.
See, it's something like that, you wouldn't want the notes on the same page as, the individual installments, but
no.
That's what endnotes are for.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be, and because he got into a lot of detail with some of those, to my recollection. And yeah, that would be a fantastic way to fill out the back of each one of those books. Would be with tons and tons of endnotes. He had, like I said, he had tons of material written on the backstories of where these characters came from and what the ad agency was that developed them in some cases and how they changed from this character and they switched over to this other character and that kind of thing. That was actually because I don't remember, like I said, I don't remember Quisp very well, but he had not only, here's this Quisp character, but then he provided that whole backstory on here they switched out Quisp and Quake and whatever. And
well, if you remember, especially in, I think it was book 3, Quake refers to some kind of competition or being defeated by Quisp. And
right.
When I was a kid, I remember there being some kind of, and maybe it was maybe an audience vote of some sort where kids or anyone could send something in where Quisp won out over Quake. I vaguely remember that as a kid. And you know, if our listeners remember that as well, or I'm misremembering this in some way, then definitely get in touch with us and let us know. But see, again, that's one of the joys of Breakfast of the Gods, right? Because it helps you recall, you know, fond, or depending on how you ate the cereal, not so fond moments with some of this breakfast cereal. You know, getting the little toys or the prizes inside, the commercials that we used to see, the characters that, you know, we remember from years back. I mean, this is just a fun comic, whether you like breakfast cereal or not.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun to read, and I remember it was one of the first ongoing serials in webcomics that I started reading on an ongoing basis, and I kept coming back to
a serial on serial.
A serial, exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
And it was one of the first ones that really caught my eye and said, "Yeah, okay, I'm gonna read reading this on an ongoing basis."
Well, again,
well
and the URL to check this out is breakfastofthegods.com. So, Sean, we started off with The Abominable Charles Christopher by Karl Kerschl. After that, we looked at The Creepy Casefiles of Margo Maloo by Drew Weing. And then we wrapped up with A Trip Down Breakfast Memory Lane, Breakfast of the Gods by Brendan Douglas Jones. So 3 really good webcomics for this month.
Excellent stuff across the board.
Yes. And if you want to find great comics, then definitely check out our sponsor for this episode, which is Discount Comic Book Service. You can go to their website, dcbservice.com, for great deals on print comics, but you can also check out their sister company, mydigitalcomics.com, for great deals on digital comics. So whether you go hard copy or digital, you can't go wrong with Discount Comic Book Service and mydigitalcomics.com. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to the website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message through SpeakPipe, or you can call us the old-fashioned way over the telephone. Our number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And, of course, you can always email us, too, if you want to send some links over to some webcomics that you think we ought to check out and review on the show. You can send a email to us both at 2guys@comicsalternative.com. That's TWOGUIS. Or you could send an email directly to me at Sean@comicsalternative.com.
And you can contact me directly at Derek@comicsalternative.com. You can also find us all over social media, such as Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can find us on TuneIn. You can also listen to us now on Spotify, and if you're an Android user, on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as the reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, by going to the website, comicsalternative.com.
That's that comicsalternative.com with that fancy new logo, too, I should point out.
That's right. We got a brand new logo, and for those of you who did not know, go to the website and check it out. It's designed by Andy Hirsch, who is a friend of this podcast. So definitely check that out, and also check us out next month with more great webcomics. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Sean, and we'll see you next month.
Oh, we are the Freakies, and this is our Freaky Street. We never miss a meal, cause we love our cereals. This is the big boss, we call him Boss Moss. Make sure you spell it right.
Snorkeldoff they call me, so handsome and pretty. He's got a weird nose.
Do I really have to sing?
My name is Grumble.
I am Mumble.
You're standing on my foot.
Margo is his name.
Small, this is my game. I know more than you do.
Says you.
And don't forget me, I'm goody-goody. I always do what's right. For instance, I eat Freaky cereal because it's got a lot of vitamins, and it's good for me.
You too can have crunchy, freaky cereal as part of your good breakfast. And there's a free freaky in specially marked boxes.
Okay, here comes the big finish.
We are